Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Speaker, this is a serious issue that I think the committee, or some members of the committee tried to get, well, in fairness, I think generally all members of the committee tried to deal with, as we had submission after submission mainly from those, as the colleagues have said, from those people who have experienced or represent or attempt to care for those people who have extreme problems in the community as a result of gambling. Now, I'm one who, like I think Mr Little and others, like all sort of, if you like, forms of addiction or forms of recreation or whatever, if one overindulges, these can become problems, whether it be alcohol, whether it become gambling or other issues. That does not mean, of course, that the vast majority in our society, I think as Mr Little said, can enjoy a flutter without, whether it be on the horses or on the pokies or in other forms of gambling, internet or what have you, without the devil grabbing them by the throat and becoming addicted to that form of gambling, and that then having an insidious negative impact both on the lives of the gambler, but obviously on the lives of those generally loved ones and family around them. I recall some years ago a constituent coming to my office, a woman who came with her kids and turned up in tears, very upset, and said that she was in difficulty, she had no money, she needed housing, what have you. And you sort of think that's a sort of almost a generic case. Somebody been booted out of home, as the landlord thrown them out, as the home been sold, whatever. What she told me, and I said to her, well, look, we'll get you to work an income and other things. What have you got? And she said to me, I've got nothing. And I said, what do you mean? Has your husband left you or whatever? And no, we have no home. The home is gone. The bank has it. We have no assets. The bank accounts have been cleaned out. I have nothing. And she meant what she stood up in and what her kids stood up in. And then, as we got through the conversation, she relayed the simple fact that her husband, unbeknownst to her, had a major gambling problem. I can't recall exactly what form. It wasn't racing, it was other forms of gambling, pokies and other things, I believe. But he had basically mown down the family resources. The house he'd sold out from under her, or the bank, had repossessed, I think how it went. The bank accounts had been cleaned out, various other channels and assets had been sold off to try and pay gambling debts, and she literally had nothing, zero. And she felt obviously a degree of ill will towards her husband, but she realised, she loved her husband, that he had a problem. And I recall that case because that woman and her family, their lives, I think we got them some assistance. I don't know what the future held for them, but their lives at that point were destroyed. And you could, cast blame on the bloke and the relationship and all these sorts of things, and I was never close enough to it to make a judgment. But for whatever reason, that bloke had a problem, and it was an addiction to gambling. And it had destroyed not only his life, but I suspect, hopefully not ultimately, but the lives at that time anyway, any of his family. And if you look at the figures, we're advised that at any given time between 0.3% and 1.8% of adults living in the community in New Zealand are likely to score as problem gamblers on standard questionnaires, which equates to between 10 and 60,000 people. Mr Speaker, it is a problem. It is a hard problem to deal with. I've got to say I oppose this legislation for many of the reasons that other colleagues have said. This bill, I think, to be blunt, no disrespect to Mr Flavel, I think it was ill-conceived in the form that it came in. I think we generally, across the House, tried to come up with some ways of achieving at least some of the objectives in a balanced way to address some of the problems. I think some of the problems that Mr Flavel brought to the committee were valid. Others, I think, were less so. But it gave us an opportunity to try and bring a bill out of the committee which had some worth and some value. And I think, putting the politics aside, there wouldn't be too many in the House that would disagree with the fact that gambling in its forms is a problem. That doesn't mean it should be outlawed as a recreational opportunity for people, it means we've got a problem. Some people are addicted, we've got to deal with that. But I've got to say, when you look at this piece of legislation, there are only effectively 4 clauses that survive from the original bill. The rest of the bill has been gutted, changed, amended or whatever, and the assessment that we make on this side of the House, and colleagues who have more knowledge than I in these matters have made, is that this bill is ineffectual. In fact, there are those like the Salvation Army who have criticised the changes in this bill, saying that they do nothing for problem gamblers, those at risk or communities wishing to manage the impact of gambling. For those, they say, for those of us who deal with the problems created by pokie machines every day, this bill on balance makes matters worse. Now, again, putting the politics aside, the Salvation Army isn't a political organisation. It's a charitable organisation, and you've got to say with a pretty amazing lineage and a pretty amazing history. Those folks in the Sally Army know about these issues. They work with these folks. They work with those who, the lost and lonelies, over a wide range of issues, but they do know about this. And I say to the government that really, apart from, the politics of this, those over the other side who are in charge of this bill should really take heed of organisations like the Salvation Army. If they are saying that this bill will make matters worse in respect of problem gambling, if they are criticising this bill and saying it does not have value, then we should really heed that, and I would counsel those in government maybe to look at pulling this and doing it properly. Because either the government hasn't listened to organisations like the Salvation Army, and I think we'd all agree they're not political. If they criticise something, they criticise things we did in government. If they criticise something, it is generally for the best motives, for very good reasons, and based on evidence and research and experience. And if they are going out and saying quite clearly that it will make, on balance, matters worse in respect of problem gambling, then you've got to ask yourself, we've failed as a parliament. Failed as a parliament. And failed those 10 to 60,000 people at any given time that have the devil grabbing them by the throat in the form of this addiction. So I suppose the question for the government is, and I'd like an explanation from a minister as we sort of mow through this piece of legislation. Presumably officials have advised and have counter-arguments in respect of the Salvation Army's criticism. I think we need to hear those in order to get some understanding as to why the government is going to force this through. We had submissions from many organisations. I see the Minister of, I think it's Internal Affairs, who's I suspect in charge of this, or ultimately responsible for this bill. I'm glad he's here. And Minister, I was just saying to the House that given that the Salvation Army has criticised this bill, has said that it will make matters worse for those in problem gambling, I'd be grateful and the Parliament would at the appropriate time if you as Minister would provide us with the advice or counter-advice that attempts to negate the criticism of a very venerable organisation made up of specialists who deal with folks who have this problem every day. They do not make judgments like this lightly on pieces of legislation. I see there are some clauses around mobility of gaming machines. There isn't anything in here in respect of communities making and taking decisions about the numbers of machines or sinking lid policies or those sorts of things that are in their jurisdiction. Again, this Parliament's sort of blanketly telling communities what to do. So my plea in respect of this, and I'm sure if we all looked at our constituent case files over the years, we would have examples similar to the one that I gave of the woman and her family who lost everything in relation to gambling. We could dredge those files out and they would pull at the heartstrings. Because at that point, there's no early warning system. That's the problem with this addiction. There's no early warning system. If you're a drunk, say, there are some pretty physical and visible early warning systems that advise people around you, some graphically and violently, that you have an alcoholic problem. Often, and the problem in the example I used, there is no early warning. In the case of this woman, the bank accounts were gone and cleaned out. She had no idea. She was a good person. There was no physicality about the symptoms of addiction in respect of her husband. So I say to the government, as we proceed through, we need to know and we need to see the advice that counters the Salvation Army's criticism Organisations like that must indeed be listened to, sir, and we need to take this matter seriously.
Dr. Chan Yang.
Mr. Speaker.